I didn't bother arguing when the HOA board president shoved the violation notice into my hand, her face red and her voice shaking with indignation. She thought she had caught me in some grand act of defiance. She kept shouting about unlicensed, livestock, and community standards, but I just stood there letting her words roll off. When she finally demanded to know how I planned to pay the mounting fines, I slid the state-issued agricultural exemption certificate across the table. Their lawyer was sitting right next to her, and I swear I heard him swallow hard. The shouting stopped. That piece of paper was more than ink and signatures. It was leverage, history, and law wrapped into one. And in that instant, every threat they had thrown my way lost its teeth. But to understand how I got to that point, you'd have to rewind a bit. I didn't move out here to fight with anyone. In fact, fighting was the last thing I wanted. After years of working in the city-long commutes, neighbors stacked one on top of another. Endless noise. I craved quiet. My grandfather had left. Me a few acres just outside town. Nothing fancy, but good solid land, mostly open field with a line of trees at the back. There was an old barn leaning sideways and a little house that had seen better days. It wasn't much by suburban standards, but to me it was everything I wanted. Space to breathe, soil I could touch with my own hands, and the ability to step. Outside at night and hear nothing but crickets, I fixed the roof, patched the siding, and built myself a routine that felt like freedom. I'd wake early, walk the fence line with a cup of coffee, and spend weekends tinkering with the barn. And then there were the chickens. A small flock at first, half a dozen hens I picked up from a local farmer. They gave me fresh eggs, but more than that, they gave me a rhythm. Feeding them in the morning, hearing them cluck contentedly as the sun came up, it was grounding. I wasn't trying to start a business. I wasn't making noise. I wasn't bothering anyone. I was just living a quieter kind of life, the kind I thought this land was meant for. That's why it blindsided me the day the first envelope arrived. It was a fine printed on HOA letterhead, accusing me of keeping farm animals in violation of community policy. At first, I thought it had been delivered to the wrong address. My land wasn't within the manicured subdivision next door. I was on the other side of a gravel road, with my own deed and my own taxes. But there it was, a demand for payment, signed by the HOA board, telling me I had 30 days to remove the livestock. I laughed at first. It had to be a mistake. Surely they didn't have jurisdiction over me. But when the second letter came, thicker, with photos of my hens attached as evidence, the amusement drained away. They weren't mistaken, they were serious. They were going to treat my chickens like some kind of criminal offense. I tried to be reasonable. I wrote back, politely but firmly, explaining that my land wasn't part of their subdivision. One attached. A copy of my property deed highlighted where the boundaries ended. I even stopped by their monthly meeting, thinking if I just explained it in person, cooler heads would prevail. Instead, I was met with smirks, eye rolls, and one board member, whispering that rules are rules. They acted as if my simple lifestyle was an attack on their perfectly mowed lawns. That was the first real turning point for me. I walked out of that meeting not angry, exactly, but cold. It was clear they weren't going to be reasonable. If anything, they saw me as an easy target, someone they could bully into compliance. They didn't realize I wasn't built that way. I grew up on this land. My grandfather fought harder battles than this just to keep it in the family. And if they wanted to test me, well, they had no idea how patient I could be when it came to standing my ground. So I changed tactics. No more polite emails that went unanswered. No more attending meetings where they chuckled at my expense. Instead, I spent evenings at my kitchen table surrounded by maps, deeds, and law books. I dug into county zoning codes, state agricultural statutes, and yes, every single bylaw the HOA had filed with the registrar. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. They were not just wrong, they were wildly overstepping. My land was classified as agricultural, not residential. Even more, I discovered something my grandfather had filed decades ago, a state agricultural exemption, locked into the deed itself, guaranteeing the right to keep small livestock without interference. It wasn't just allowed, it was protected, while They were stacking fines, I was stacking evidence. Every letter they sent, I saved. Every violation notice they taped to my gate, I photographed. Neighbors stopped waving as much. A few crossed the street to avoid me. That was fine. I wasn't looking for allies. I had the law on my side, and I was patient enough to let them hang themselves with their own rope. By the time they called me into their so-called hearing, I was ready. They sat me at the end of a long table like some sort of defendant, the board fanning out across from me with their lawyer at the center. They started with bluster talk of escalating fines, threats of liens, even the word foreclosure. Slipped out, I let them talk, I let them posture, and then, when the room had quieted enough, I slid the folder across the table. Inside, my deed, county zoning maps, and most importantly, the agricultural exemption certified by the state. The lawyer picked it up first. I watched his eyes flick back and forth, lips pressed tighter with each line he read. The president tried to keep up the performance, barking about community standards. But even she faltered when the lawyer leaned over and whispered something in her ear. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd heard in months. They didn't apologize, not out loud. Pride wouldn't let them, but the fines stopped arriving. The notices disappeared from my gate, and one by one I noticed the board. Members starting to step down. The president, who had screamed the loudest, resigned for personal reasons. The lawyer, I heard, advised them not to pursue any further action against me or risk a lawsuit they would surely lose. Life has a way of settling back into rhythm after a storm. These days, the chickens are still there, scratching in the dirt, laying their eggs. The land is quiet again, the way I wanted it from the beginning. Neighbors don't bother me anymore. Some nod politely, others avoid eye contact. Either way, it's peace. And that's what I came here for. Sometimes I think back to those board meetings. The smug looks, the threats tossed so casually across the table. They thought they were powerful because they had a title and a clipboard. But real power isn't in loud voices or empty threats. It's in the paper trail. It's in knowing the law better than the people who try to weaponize it. Now, when I sit on my porch at dusk, watching the chickens settle into their coop, I feel something deeper than relief. It's pride not in beating them, but in knowing I stood my ground without lowering myself to their level. I didn't need to scream, threaten, or rage. I just had to be patient, prepared, and willing to fight with intelligence instead of noise. And the best part? Every egg I collect in the morning feels like a quiet reminder. A reminder that this land is mine, my life is mine, and no HOA can change that.